How are you?
I'm doing well, Jay. How are you?
Awesome, really good. It's been, thank you so much for letting us invade your house again. It's been a year, I think, roughly, since we were up here the last time. Is that right?
That is correct. I'm always glad to have you guys over.
Well, thank you. You're always a very gracious host. So what we have here is, when we were here last time, we were sitting around talking about, in addition to your saltwater tank, in addition to doing some spectrum testing, you're thinking about setting up a freshwater tank to test out the Radion XR15s and try your hand at a freshwater setup. Here we are, a year later, but this tank hasn't even been around that long, right?
This tank is today 1 month and 26 days old. So it's had water less than 2 months, and yet you can see it's fully grown. I already had to trim it 3 times.
Wow.
Yes.
How big were the plants when you got it?
So everything comes in small containers. The company is called Tropica, and the containers are literally this big. It's like a yogurt container, and it has one particular species of plant. And you just go in and you buy any one you want. So I've probably bought about 12 plants. So 12 different species, and I've planted them, and certain ones have grown really fast, some have taken a while to grow in, but as you can see now everyone has grown to its pretty much full potential.
Wow. I mean, and the aquascaping in here is pretty much almost completely covered. I mean, I see you've got the wood, and we've got that nice flow going from shorter to higher.
Yes.
Do the plants, did you pick these plants specifically for their height and color mix, or?
Yes, I've tried. I knew that, for example, this red plant is going to be pretty low, and I wanted to keep it in the foreground. You know, your carpet is clearly marked, and this is the one that actually is going to be all around. It's kind of your lawn area. And then I knew there would be a few fast-growing high stalks, which is these 2 species, as well as there's a couple of them here. I may still move things around, but this was pretty much my first kind of try at this.
And equipment-wise, obviously we have the Radions, which we'll talk about that in a second.
Yes.
But looking under the cabinet, we've got, it looks like you use some fertilizer, a little CO2, and you have a canister filter, right?
Yes. With
anything else going on?
That's an excellent question. So originally I was just going to go with this, but what I have run into on about day 20th was a completely new symptom to me. It was a green water. Basically, the whole tank started going green, and me coming from more reef hobby for the past 7 years, basically I think I've used too much light, and that have just spiked things, considering that this was a brand new tank. So I did have to go out and buy the UV sterilizer, which I've plumbed in, and it took care of algae within 3 days. So within 3 days the water was clear, and since then I've been running it just to be safe.
So you're running a UV sterilizer to keep the water nice and clear.
Yes.
And then did you back off on the lighting at all? What are we running here in terms of spectrum? These are obviously XR15 Fresh Waters. I thought you started with 4 of them. Did you start with 4 of them?
I did start with 4, and you were my inspiration because I've always admired your tank, and you had 5 on a reef. So, me coming from a reef as well, I figured the more light, the better. This was the oldest adage. But the thing is, with 4 lights, it was just producing too much power, even at running it at a 30% intensity. So I had to dial back. I've used the par meter, remeasured all of the lighting, and the spread on these ones is so great that basically each one covers at least this much, if not more, and there's a bit of an overlap. So if anything, I've got rid of one Radion, and I've also lowered the intensity a little bit, as well as the photo period. And I think I got things dialed in now, just right.
And so what are the par readings that you're getting on this particular setup?
So I'm aiming for about 80.
80.
So if you go somewhere where this red plant is, somewhere around there, you will see about 80 to maybe 90. Closer to the foreground, you will get maybe 60, and probably this is going to be a little bit higher right where the 2 of them meet. But on average, I'd say 80, 90 is the maximum that I'm going with.
So, but it must be quite a bit higher up here, right? In the 100?
Yeah.
100, 120? Or?
Here it would be about 120. That's correct.
Okay, so up at the top here.
Probably
where the plants
this
are.
much.
I
Yes.
got you.
So.
Okay. And I've heard with freshwater plants, they tolerate different light levels or have a preference for different light levels. So did you take that into account in terms of the layout, or how did you get to those numbers? Was it trial and error, or by researching the plants, or what exactly?
So what I did is I definitely had to go back and just go through some of the books and also read up a little bit on the forums. There's no as clear-cut school of thought as it is with the reef when it comes to freshwater. But on average, they group things into 3 different categories: the low-level or low-light plants, the medium plants, and then the high ones. And the high ones start with about 70, 80 par and up. So there's no upper ceiling to this. You just basically have to compensate with CO2, and also you're going to be trimming it a lot more frequently. So
more light, add in more CO2
yes.
to compensate, so the plant's getting enough CO2 to go with the lighting, and then all you'll get is just faster growth, which means more cutting.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
So how much, we got the par numbers, so what is the photo period that you run this on during the main program?
It's about 8 hours.
8 hours.
So yes, there's a bit of a ramp up and ramp down, but on average it's about 8 hours.
Okay. And how much CO2 are you pumping in?
So what I'm using is it's a 2-step approach. First of all, there's this thing called a drop checker, and this thing has to be submersed in water. But basically, there is a solution here that will change color, not right away, but within an hour or two, from kind of bluish to all the way to yellow. And you want it in a green to slightly yellowish tint that gives you just enough CO2 percentage in the water.
Oh,
so
that sounds easy. Do you have to change the liquid in there at all, or it's pretty?
I think you have to change it every few weeks to a month. I haven't changed mine because what I've done is I've added a fail-safe, and this is really the way to go, which is this pH probe. And basically, once you know your pH, which you need to calibrate to freshwater, so it's slightly different. You need a different solution than for a reef. You calibrate it, and then knowing your hardness of the water, which is kH, there's a formula that, given that and pH, you will know exactly your CO2 levels. And I do have an Apex system currently running this, which is just a very fancy controller. And all it does is it says, okay, if my pH goes less than 6.45, turn on the CO2 and wait for a little bit. As soon as you're lower, so injecting CO2 will bring your pH down. If it goes lower than 6.45, it's going to turn off, wait for half an hour, and then remeasure it, and then try it again and again and again. And at night, you don't need to run any CO2.
Now, will that reach an equilibrium on its own over time, in terms of you'll have to do less on and off monitoring with the CO2, or is that generally the best way to go about running a Planet aquarium, where you keep the lighting constant and then you adjust the CO2 based on what's being consumed in the tank?
From what I've heard, this is the fanciest, but also the best way of doing it, because you are guaranteed the amount of CO2. Otherwise, you have to be a little bit more experienced, and you have to kind of guess, because it's a bit of a spike. When the lights just come on, you don't want too much CO2, so you probably want to turn on the CO2 maybe half an hour earlier, but then you got to find that balance where your lights are at full intensity, the plants are now consuming it, and then you introduce just enough CO2, and this is where you count the bubbles on a special checker to basically know when to how much to introduce to not to oversaturate the water. Because the thing is, if you overdo CO2, then your fish start gasping for air and they may die. Many experienced people, aquarists, what they would do is they would actually look for fish and their behavior. If it becomes erratic, they'll know and they will dial back in.
So you base your CO2 injection on the perceived amount of oxygen that's in the system based on how the fish are responding.
Correct. So.
Got you. Very cool. All right, well, I don't have a lot more questions. I'm a little bit jealous. I kind of want to go home and set up a freshwater tank now because this looks absolutely stunning. And, and what you've just told me is that it's relatively simple, in terms of the equipment-wise. Obviously, setting up the CO2 system requires a little more work, but if I do so, I can at least take your lighting settings and implement those, right? So
thank you.
Thank you. And, once again, thanks so much for sharing your tank with us.
It's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to doing another video in a few months to a year. So,
very cool.
Thank you, Jay.
Cool. Thank you, Dimitry.